Story 1. I woke suddenly to the buzz of my phone vibrating against the nightstand, the screen glowing in the dark. It was almost 2 a.m., and the caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. My first instinct was to ignore it, chalking it up to a wrong number. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed there was a voicemail. Curiosity, half-wakened and insistent, tugged at me. Expecting an automated message or maybe someone dialing the wrong contact in their sleep, I pressed play. What I heard sent a cold shiver crawling down my spine. The voicemail was just the sound of breathing, soft, deliberate, and unmistakably mine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to listen. The sound in the recording mirrored the shallow rhythm of my own inhalations, the kind I make when lying in bed half asleep. It lasted no more than 15 seconds, but in that short time, my mind spiraled with questions. Who had recorded this? How did they have it? And most disturbingly, why? I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the phone in disbelief. A chill crept over me as I replayed the message, hoping, praying, that I had misunderstood. But it was undeniable. It was my breathing. There were no background noises, no clues to point me toward a logical explanation. Just my own breath, caught in some strange, intimate rhythm of invasion. I checked the timestamp on the call, 1:55 a.m. The number was untraceable, no caller ID. My mind reeled, and though I told myself it had to be a glitch, a prank, something mundane, I couldn't shake the unease that burrowed deep into my chest. I spent the next hour scouring the internet for answers, scrolling through forums and articles about spoofed calls and hacked voicemails. Every explanation I found felt too far-fetched or too elaborate for a random prankster. By 3:30, I was exhausted and no closer to understanding. Frustrated and uneasy, I silenced my phone, pulled the blanket tighter around me, and tried to sleep. But as I began to drift off, the phone buzzed again, vibrating harshly against the wooden table. My pulse quickened, and I hesitated before reaching for it. Another voicemail. The same number. I pressed play, my thumb trembling against the screen. This time, the breathing was louder, more insistent. And the rhythm, it had changed. It matched the shallow, panicked breaths I was taking at that exact moment. My chest tightened as I sat there, clutching the phone, my thoughts racing. Was someone in the house? Watching me? Listening? I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every shadowed corner, every darkened crevice, the closet, the window, the door. Everything seemed in its place, but the sense of being watched clung to me like a second skin. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept through the house, checking every lock, every window, every dark corner. Nothing was out of place. But the stillness only heightened my fear. Morning came, but the light did little to soothe the dread that had seeped into my bones. Exhausted and jittery, I resolved to block the number and put it behind me. By nightfall, I convinced myself it had been a cruel joke, nothing more. I even managed a strained laugh at my own paranoia. But that relief was short-lived. At 1:30 a.m., the buzzing started again. The number was different this time, but the voicemail was the same. My breathing, uneven, shaky, trembling, filled the recording. I felt my stomach drop as I listened, the timestamp showing the voicemail had been left moments after the call. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind. Blocking the number wouldn't solve this. Someone was toying with me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, every noise amplified, the creak of floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind brushing against the windows. Morning brought no relief. I went to the police, hoping they could trace the calls, make sense of this nightmare. The officer listened patiently, took notes, and asked if I had enemies or had shared my number publicly. I shook my head, feeling helpless. He suggested I change my number and promised to investigate, though his tone carried skepticism. That night, I went to bed drained, hoping it was over. But the phone buzzed again at 2:30 a.m., and this time, the voicemail was longer, nearly 30 seconds. The breathing was harsher now, almost frantic, as if I was running. And at the end, a whisper, a faint, almost imperceptible noise that made my blood run cold. I replayed it over and over, holding the phone close to my ear, but the words were too soft to make out. Fear consumed me. I couldn't stay in the house another night. I packed a bag and stayed with a friend, hoping the distance would bring me peace. For a few days, it did. My friend's company made me feel safe, and I even slept soundly for the first time in days. But when I turned my phone back on, the notifications were waiting for new voicemails from 4 different numbers. I listened to them with trembling hands. The breathing grew more frantic with each recording, and in the final message, the whisper was unmistakable. It said my name. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking as my friend rushed over. She listened to the voicemail, her face going pale. "We need to call the police," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. This time, I didn't argue. At the station, the same officer was visibly more concerned after hearing the recordings. A detective was assigned to my case, and I handed over my phone for analysis, desperate for answers. That night, I stayed with my friend again, trying to cling to some semblance of safety. But just as we started to relax, her phone buzzed. She frowned, picking it up. "It's an unknown number," she said, her voice uneasy. When she played the voicemail, the sound of her own breathing filled the room. Story 2. That morning, I woke up groggy, the remnants of a restless night clinging to me like cobwebs. The house was still, save for the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I shuffled to the front door, craving the crisp air and maybe the familiarity of the morning paper to ground myself. But as I reached for the doorknob, a strange, creeping sensation stopped me, a prickling awareness, like eyes boring into the back of my head. I hesitated, hand hovering for just a moment, then opened the door. The street outside looked normal at first glance, bathed in soft, gray light. But then, I saw it, a small white note lying neatly at the edge of the welcome mat. It wasn't folded, and its message stood out in bold, jagged handwriting, "Don't go outside." My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at the words as my heart began pounding in my chest. A prank, I told myself. It had to be a prank. But something about the writing, it felt sharp, urgent, like it wasn't meant to be ignored. The street was too quiet, unnaturally so. I peered down both ends of the road, expecting to see a neighbor, a jogger, or even someone lurking. But there was no one. It was as if the world outside had been paused, the usual sounds of life stolen away. Swallowing my unease, I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me with trembling fingers. I set the note on the kitchen table, its message glaring up at me. My coffee maker gurgled in the background, a small comfort in the growing unease. I sipped my coffee, hoping to shake off the feeling, but the silence outside seemed to press against the windows, suffocating. I pulled the curtains aside to scan the street again. Cars were parked as they always were, no one passed by, but it all felt wrong, like the air itself was heavier. When I tried calling a few neighbors to see if they had received anything similar, no one picked up. My nerves frayed further as the hours crept by. By mid-morning, I noticed something else odd: the mail hadn't arrived. Our mail carrier was always punctual, arriving just after 7, but now it was nearly noon. I paced the living room, debating whether to ignore the note and step outside. It was just paper, after all. But every time I moved toward the door, a sense of dread rooted me in place. And then it happened, the first knock. Soft, deliberate, like someone testing the waters. My breath hitched, and I froze, staring at the door. A second knock followed, louder this time. I crept to the peephole, my pulse hammering in my ears, but when I looked, there was nothing. The street outside was just as empty and still as it had been all morning. I spent the afternoon caught between paranoia and logic, trying to distract myself with the television. But the hum of the screen wasn't enough to drown out the mounting fear. Every so often, I would glance out the window, and every time, the neighborhood looked more alien, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. As evening fell, a new sound reached me, a faint, shuffling noise. My heart sank. I crept to the window, carefully parting the curtain just enough to peer outside. Several houses down, a figure stood still as a statue, partially obscured by the lengthening shadows of the setting sun. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of someone standing motionless, their head tilted unnaturally, as if they were listening. I dropped the curtain and stumbled back. My mind raced. It had to be a passerby, I told myself. Someone lost or waiting for a ride. But when I checked again, the figure was closer, now standing directly in front of my neighbor's house. The way it moved, or didn't move, was wrong. It didn't walk so much as glide, its movements too smooth, too silent. I turned off most of the lights, the glow inside the house suddenly feeling like a beacon. I stayed hidden in the darker corners, clutching my phone and debating whether to call the police. But what could I even say? A note told me not to go outside, and now there's someone standing in the street. It sounded absurd, even to me. Night swallowed the house, and the figure disappeared into the shadows. I locked every door and window, trying to convince myself it was over. Then, at 9 p.m., the power flickered. The lights blinked out, plunging the house into darkness. I scrambled for a flashlight, heart racing, and when the lights returned a few seconds later, I heard it, a faint tapping at the back door. The sound was steady, deliberate. My breath hitched as I gripped a kitchen knife and crept toward the noise. The tapping grew louder as I neared the door. My knees buckled when I turned the corner and saw it, a face on the other side of the glass. The condensation blurred its features, but the way it moved, small, jerky tilts of the head, sent cold fear coursing through me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the knife. My mind screamed at me to run, but I had nowhere to go. Instead, I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching the knife and my phone, dialing 911 but not pressing call. Hours passed in tense silence. I stayed pressed against the wall, ears straining for any sound. Just when I began to think the figure was gone, I heard it, heavy footsteps inside the house. My stomach twisted. The intruder had found a way in. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a knock, loud, deliberate. "I know you're in there," a voice growled, low and raspy. The doorknob rattled violently, and I braced myself, clutching the knife tighter. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I waited, motionless, until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. Only then did I unlock the bedroom door. The house was empty. The figure, the note, the intruder, it all felt like a fever dream. But the scratches on the back door told me otherwise. To this day, I don't know who left that note or who broke into my house that night. But one thing is certain, I'll never step outside after dark again. Story 3. The night had a stillness to it, the kind that wrapped around you and amplified every small sound. My computer hummed softly as I worked late into the hours when most of the world was asleep. The glow of the monitor painted shadows across the walls, flickering faintly as I typed. A half-empty cup of coffee sat beside me, cold and forgotten, a casualty of my focus. The clock on the desk read 2 a.m., its red digits glaring a silent warning. I told myself it was time to stop, to head to bed, but something about the quiet had me lingering. As I reached to shut the computer down, the screen froze. I paused, staring at it, assuming it was just another typical glitch. With a sigh, I moved the mouse and tapped a few keys. Nothing happened. Then, the screen flickered. It went black for a breathless moment, and a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. When the display returned, it wasn't the familiar sight of my desktop. Instead, it showed a grainy video feed. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what I was looking at, me. I saw myself sitting at my desk, wearing the same clothes, the same tired look in my eyes. But the room behind me was all wrong. The walls were a dull, featureless gray. The shelves, the clutter, the small comforts of my space, none of it was there. My surroundings were unrecognizable. My first thought was that someone had hacked into my webcam. My pulse quickened as I tried to close the feed, to shut the computer down entirely. The mouse was unresponsive. The keyboard wouldn't cooperate. It was as if the computer had been completely hijacked. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling, but I hesitated. Who would I call? What would I even say? Then, the version of me in the video turned. Slowly. Deliberately. It was subtle at first, the tilt of a head acknowledging the camera. But when it looked directly into the lens, the unease I'd felt exploded into full-blown dread. It smiled, a slow, deliberate smile. Not a friendly one. Not mine. My doppelganger leaned out of view for a moment and returned holding a piece of paper. One word was scrawled on it in bold, jagged letters, "Look." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The silence in the room pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. Against my better judgment, I glanced around, scanning the shadows of my familiar surroundings. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Then, faintly, I heard it, a low, steady hum of static coming from somewhere inside the house. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, but curiosity propelled me forward. My legs felt like lead as I moved toward the sound. It led me to the living room. There, the television flickered to life on its own, displaying the same live feed. My blood ran cold as I stared at the screen. It was the same gray room, the same version of me, but now the figure was standing. It moved closer to the camera, the distorted image of my face filling the screen. I backed away, unsure of what to do. Then, the figure mouthed a single word, "Come." My heart pounded as I returned to my desk, desperate to make sense of it all. But when I sat down, the screen had changed again. The figure was gone. The gray room was empty, save for a single door, slightly ajar. I pressed the power button on the computer, but it refused to shut down. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I jumped, fumbling to retrieve it. The caller ID was blocked. I answered, my voice shaking as I whispered, "Hello." A distorted voice rasped through the static, "You need to come now." The line went dead before I could respond. The feed on the screen shifted again. The door in the gray room opened wider, revealing a hallway bathed in darkness. The camera moved forward, as though carried by unseen hands. I watched, frozen in place, as it crept down the corridor. My stomach churned as the view stopped in front of a door I knew all too well, my bedroom door. I bolted from my desk, my pulse roaring in my ears. When I reached the door, I paused, pressing my ear against it. There was no sound. No movement. Gathering every ounce of courage I could muster, I pushed the door open and flicked on the light. The room was empty, just as I'd left it. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, as though someone had been there moments before. Then, my phone buzzed again. A text message this time. The sender was unknown. The message was simple, chilling, "Behind you." I spun around, my chest tightening as I prepared for the worst. But the hallway was empty. The house was still. The only sound was the pounding of my heart and the faint, electric hum of the static that seemed to linger everywhere I went. For days after, strange things continued to happen. Objects moved without explanation. Doors I'd closed were found ajar. Every night, I heard the faint hiss of static, like an old television left on somewhere in the distance. One evening, as I lay in bed, the static grew louder. It pulled me from my restless sleep and led me back to the living room. The television had turned itself on again, displaying the same gray room. This time, though, it was completely empty. I moved to turn the television off, but before I could, the screen went black. A single word appeared in stark white letters: "Goodbye." The static ceased. The television powered off, and the house fell into silence. Days turned to weeks, and the incident stopped. I convinced myself it was over. Whatever it had been, it was gone. Life slowly returned to normal. But late one night, as I was settling into bed, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a picture message. The sender was unknown. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it. The image was of me, sitting at my desk, taken from behind. Story 4. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, the kind of early where the world feels unnaturally still. My head felt heavy, a dull fog clouding my thoughts. As I sat up, I noticed a faint light spilling out from the kitchen. That shouldn't have been possible. I always double-check everything before heading to bed. I frowned, my unease building as I rubbed my temples, trying to shake the grogginess. Shuffling toward the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound cutting through the oppressive quiet. Still, the air carried something else, a kind of tension that made my skin prickle. It wasn't loud, but it was there, like an unspoken warning hanging over me. I stepped into the kitchen, and froze. There, on the table, was a perfectly plated meal. The chicken was golden and crisp, the vegetables steamed to vibrant perfection, and the mashed potatoes swirled into delicate peaks, almost too beautiful to eat. My stomach churned, not with hunger but with a creeping sense of unease. 3 nights ago, I'd eaten this exact meal. But I hadn't made it since. I hadn't even thought about it. I stood there, heart pounding, my eyes darting around the room. The silence pressed down on me like a weight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I stepped closer to the table. The details made my blood run cold. The fork and knife were arranged just as I would have placed them, the napkin folded the way I'd done since childhood, and even the glass of water was filled to the exact level I always preferred. It was as if someone had taken a snapshot of my routine and recreated it with eerie precision. I couldn't stay still any longer. My first instinct was to check the house, to see if someone had broken in. I moved quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears as I checked the front door. It was bolted, just as I'd left it. The windows were all shut, no sign of tampering. The back door was locked. The garage was untouched. Panic started to claw at the edges of my mind. Who could know these little details? Who could have done this? And how had they gotten in? As I stood there, debating whether to call someone, though I wasn't sure anyone would believe me, a soft creak echoed from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, the sound of weight shifting on floorboards. I turned toward the sound, each step I took down the hall feeling heavier than the last. The air seemed thicker here, charged with something I couldn't name. My bedroom door, which I had left ajar the night before, was now shut. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My pulse thundered in my ears as I twisted it and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I'd left it. Every corner was untouched, every item in its place. Yet, the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered, as though unseen eyes were following my every move. I checked under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains, nothing. I backed out of the room, leaving the door wide open this time. Returning to the kitchen, I found the meal still sitting there, pristine and untouched. For a moment, I just stared at it, paralyzed with indecision. Should I throw it away? Call someone? Leave? Eventually, I grabbed my phone and snapped a few photos of the table, zooming in on every unsettling detail. But as I reviewed the images, my stomach dropped. In the reflection of the glass of water, there was a faint outline of a figure standing in the doorway behind me. My chest seized as I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The doorway was empty. Nothing there. Just the yawning, silent shadows of the house. I looked back at the photos, desperate to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it, but the figure was gone. Only the reflection of the glass and the meal remained. I collapsed onto the couch, clutching my phone, replaying the moment in my mind. There had been someone there. I was sure of it. I sat there for hours, unwilling to move, as the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the windows. The once threatening shadows faded, but the dread lingered. I forced myself to stand, legs trembling, and returned to the kitchen. The table was empty. The plate, the utensils, the glass of water, everything was gone, as though it had never been there in the first place. I searched the house again, desperately trying to find any evidence, any explanation. But there was nothing. No signs of intrusion. No proof of what I'd seen. For days, I told myself it was some bizarre, unexplainable coincidence, a trick of the mind. But then, one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something. My bedside table had been rearranged. The items were placed in the exact order I used to keep them years ago, a way I hadn't organized them in ages. The dread came rushing back, sharper this time, sinking its claws into me. This wasn't over. Someone, or something, was in my home. Watching. Waiting. And I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't alone. Story 5. The faint buzz of my phone pulled me from a restless sleep. My eyes, heavy with fatigue, opened reluctantly to the dim light of early morning. Shadows stretched long and jagged across my bedroom, dancing ominously as I stirred. Groggy, I reached for my phone on the bedside table, the screen glowing softly. A single notification blinked, and when I saw her name, my stomach clenched. Cold sweat formed on my skin. My breath caught in my throat. She had been missing for over a week, no trace, no leads. And yet, there it was. Her name. Her message. I unlocked the phone with trembling fingers, the single line of text staring back at me like a taunt, "Come to the old bridge by 4 a.m. My mind reeled. How could this be possible? The police had combed through every lead, every shadow. Friends and family were frantic, unraveling in the face of her disappearance. And now, at the most ungodly hour, a message, simple, cryptic, and chilling, appeared as if nothing had happened. For a moment, I considered replying, asking if it was really her, but my fingers froze over the keyboard. Fear rooted me to the bed. What if it wasn't her? The old bridge. Memories of it flickered in my mind, a place from our childhood, where summers seemed eternal, where we dared each other to cross its rotting planks. Now, though, the idea of returning there filled me with dread. It was abandoned, overgrown, and miles outside of town, hidden deep in the woods where no one would hear you scream. By 3 a.m., I couldn't sit idle any longer. The thought of her, alive, waiting, needing me, was unbearable. Maybe this was the only chance to find her. Maybe time was slipping through my fingers. I dressed quickly, my hands trembling as I grabbed my keys. The house felt unnervingly silent, as though the air itself was bracing for something to come. The drive to the bridge was no better. The town, typically serene at night, felt suffocating. Each turn down those empty, winding roads pressed heavier on my chest. The bridge loomed ahead, shrouded in shadows. Rotting wood, rusted rails, and an eerie stillness that seemed to echo with whispers from the past. Parking a few feet away, I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. What if this was a trap? What if I wasn't supposed to leave here alive? Before I could second-guess myself, my phone buzzed again. Another message. I unlocked the screen with a sharp intake of breath, under the bridge. The space beneath the bridge had once been a riverbed, long dried up and choked with weeds and debris. The memory of it made my stomach churn. Stepping out into the cold night, I shivered, my breath fogging in the air. The trees seemed to press closer around me, their branches clawing at the sky. Cautiously, I approached the edge of the bridge, peering down into the darkness below. My flashlight trembled in my hand, casting shaky beams of light into the pitch-black void. And there it was, a bracelet lying on the ground. Her bracelet. The one she never took off, the one with her initials etched into the clasp. My throat tightened as I crouched to pick it up, the metal cold against my skin. She had been here. Then, from behind me, came the faintest noise, a shuffle of footsteps on dirt. I spun around, my heart hammering. The flashlight beam wavered, barely piercing the surrounding blackness. "Hello." My voice cracked as I called out, the silence swallowing my words. The sound grew louder, closer, circling. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I was frozen in place, gripping the flashlight like it was my lifeline. Suddenly, the noise stopped. And then I saw her. She was standing just beyond the reach of the light, her figure barely visible in the shadows. My breath hitched. It was her face, undeniably her, but something was wrong. Her skin was pale, almost gray, her clothes torn and filthy. She stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Are you okay?" I stammered, taking a tentative step forward. She didn't move. "We've been looking for you," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head slightly, her lips moving, but no sound came out. I leaned in, straining to hear. Finally, in a voice so faint it sent shivers down my spine, she whispered, "Run." Before I could respond, she disappeared. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone, swallowed by the shadows. The air grew icy, a suffocating stillness wrapping itself around me. Then the shuffling returned, this time from every direction. Panic surged through me as I scrambled up the embankment, slipping on the damp earth. The flashlight flickered, its beam sputtering like a dying heartbeat. I reached the top, gasping for air, and sprinted for the car. My hands fumbled with the keys, slipping in my grip as the shuffling grew louder behind me. When the engine roared to life, I didn't look back. I couldn't. The drive home was a blur, the darkened roads twisting and distorting in my peripheral vision. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car, shaking uncontrollably. Her face, her voice, her warning, all of it played on a loop in my mind. I stumbled into the house, locking every door and window behind me. My phone lay on the counter, silent and empty of any new messages. For a moment, I convinced myself it had all been a nightmare. But as I turned to head upstairs, something on the nightstand caught my eye. Her bracelet. The one I'd left under the bridge. It was sitting there, gleaming faintly in the dim light. And I wasn't alone. Story 6. It started as a mistake, a wrong number text that somehow turned into weeks of conversation. At first, it felt harmless, even charming. Their messages were quick, clever, and laced with humor that mirrored my own. Before I knew it, I found myself looking forward to their replies, like reconnecting with an old friend I'd never met. One late night, the conversation was flowing effortlessly when I sent a playful message, half joking, "So, when do we meet?" Their response came immediately. "I am not who you think I am." I froze, staring at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as my mind raced. I typed and erased a dozen responses before finally settling on, "What do you mean?" The silence stretched unbearably. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to call them. My heart pounded as the phone rang. It went straight to voicemail, and the distorted, robotic tone of their voice sent a chill down my spine. Why would someone go to such lengths to hide their identity? That evening, another text came. "Please stop trying to find out who I am. It's for your own good." Fear replaced frustration. I typed back, asking if I was in danger. "Not yet," they replied. The ambiguity of their words left me sleepless that night. I tossed and turned, every creak of the floorboards amplifying my growing paranoia. The next morning, I noticed my doormat had been moved, slightly askew. I had straightened it the day before. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. A close friend urged me to block the number and move on, but I couldn't let it go. I needed closure. I sent one last text. If you care about my safety, tell me what's going on. Hours passed before the response came. You'll regret this. The next morning, I woke to find my car windshield shattered. On the driver's seat was a single note. Stop digging. I went to the police, but there was little they could do without evidence. The feeling of safety I'd taken for granted evaporated. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, unseen but suffocating. Desperate, I went to my phone carrier to trace the number. The employee frowned, scanning the records. This number doesn't exist, they said. I stared at them in disbelief, pulling up the messages on my phone, but they were gone. Every text had vanished. My stomach churned. Had I imagined all of it? But the shattered windshield and the note were real, weren't they? Later that night, an email appeared in my inbox from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "You were warned." The message contained a single line. "Do not try to find me again." Attached was a photo of me sitting on my couch, taken from outside my window. My hands trembled as I slammed my laptop shut and double-checked every lock in my apartment. I stayed with a friend, hoping distance would provide some relief. For a few days, it worked. Then my friend began receiving texts from the same number. "You can't hide forever." Terrified, I went to the police again, but without concrete proof, they couldn't help me. I changed my number, deleted my social media, and tried to disappear. For weeks, there was silence. Slowly, I began to believe it was over. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed. My chest tightened. The message was from an unknown number. Did you really think it would be that easy? I felt the walls closing in. No matter where I went, they found me. Desperation drove me to drastic action. I moved to a new city, changed my name, and cut ties with anyone who might inadvertently reveal my whereabouts. The isolation was suffocating, but it felt like the only way to survive. For months, I lived in fear, jumping at every shadow and avoiding new relationships. Eventually, the messages stopped. Slowly, cautiously, I began to rebuild my life. Years later, I can look back without breaking into a cold sweat. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, wondering. Who were they? What did they want? I'll probably never know. But one thing is certain, some wrong numbers are better left unanswered. Story 7. That morning, I woke earlier than usual, the chill of the cold tile floor biting against my bare feet as I swung my legs out of bed. The world outside was still cloaked in darkness, with only the faintest whispers of dawn filtering through the curtains. My apartment, small and familiar, greeted me with its usual creaks and groans as I stretched. I'd lived alone for years, and those predictable sounds were a comfort, a reminder that this space was mine and mine alone. But as I stepped into the hallway, a jolt of unease shot through me. Something was wrong. At first, I couldn't place it. Then I saw them, a pair of shoes sitting in the middle of the hallway. They weren't mine. The shoes were worn, scuffed, and covered in patches of damp mud. Their bulky soles were nothing like the slim, clean styles I usually wore. They were too large for me, too foreign, and their presence made my chest tighten. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at them as a cold, creeping sensation began to crawl up my spine. Rational thoughts bubbled up, attempting to explain the inexplicable. Had I brought these in somehow and forgotten? Maybe I'd accidentally grabbed the wrong pair from somewhere. But no, these were entirely unfamiliar. Slowly, hesitantly, I bent down and picked one up. The material was damp, the mud fresh enough to smear onto my fingers. A faint, earthy smell clung to them, mixed with something sharper, almost metallic, that I couldn't place. I dropped the shoe back onto the floor as if it had burned me. My heart thudded in my chest. This had to be a prank. That was the only logical explanation. My neighbors, perhaps. But how? I lived alone. My door had been locked all night, and I hadn't heard a single unusual sound. The idea of someone sneaking in and out undetected sent a wave of nausea rolling through me. I walked to the front door, more to reassure myself than anything else. The lock was secure. The chain was latched. The deadbolt hadn't been touched. I checked the windows next, each one shut tight, their latches intact. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches near the locks, no broken glass. Nothing. Yet the shoes sat there, mute and unyielding, an unwelcome intruder in my space. I moved them to the front door, intending to deal with them later. I tried to focus on my usual routine, making coffee, tidying up, but the unease lingered like a shadow, following me from room to room. Even as the bitter aroma of coffee filled the air, it did little to calm me. The sensation of being watched clung to me like a second skin, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. I couldn't stop glancing at the hallway, half expecting to see the shoes move on their own. By afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I carried the shoes outside and left them by the curb, near the trash bins. As I walked back inside, I felt a faint sense of relief, like I'd cast out a bad omen. That night, I triple-checked every lock, every latch, every window before crawling into bed. For the first time that day, I let myself relax. Whatever strange occurrence had brought those shoes into my life, it was over. Or so I thought. The next morning, I woke with a heavy sense of foreboding. As I stepped into the hallway, my stomach twisted into knots. The shoes were back. They sat in the exact same spot as before, but this time, they were different. The mud and grime had been wiped away, and the leather seemed to gleam faintly in the morning light. The scuffs that had once marked their surface were gone, as if someone had lovingly restored them. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold wave of terror washed over me. I checked the door again. Locked. The chain. Latched. The windows. Untouched. There was no sign of forced entry, no way anyone could have snuck in without me knowing. And yet, the shoes were here. I called a friend, my voice shaking as I tried to explain. But even as the words left my mouth, they sounded absurd. Shoes don't just appear out of nowhere. My friend laughed nervously, suggesting I was overtired, maybe stressed. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I knew this was no hallucination. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. That night, I left every light on and curled up on the couch, blanket pulled tightly around me. I was too afraid to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a faint creaking sound. My heart stopped. It was coming from the hallway. The slow, deliberate groan of floorboards under weight. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The creaking grew louder, inching closer. It stopped just outside the living room. I held my breath, waiting, expecting someone, or something, to appear. But nothing came. Gathering what little courage I had, I crept toward the hallway. The shoes were gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned back toward the couch, my blood ran cold. There they were, sitting neatly by the armrest as if waiting for me. My scream caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling beneath me, and grabbed my phone with shaking hands. The 911 operator's calm voice was the only thing that kept me grounded as I choked out my story. Police arrived shortly after, but they found nothing. No signs of a break-in, no intruder, nothing. The shoes, of course, were there. They offered no answers, just a silent, mocking presence. I couldn't stay. I packed a bag and checked into a motel, desperate to escape. For a few nights, I slept peacefully, but when I returned to my apartment to gather more belongings, the shoes were waiting for me. They were in the hallway, just as before, and I knew then that I couldn't escape them. Desperation turned to resolve. I carried the shoes outside, doused them in lighter fluid, and set them ablaze. The flames devoured the leather, the soles curling and blackening as smoke spiraled into the sky. That night, for the first time in days, I slept soundly. The shoes didn't return, and the oppressive feeling that had haunted me began to fade. I don't know what they were or why they chose me, but I choose to believe they're gone for good. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 8. It was one of those nights when the silence felt heavy, pressing against the walls of the house like an invisible force. The clock had just ticked past 10 p.m., and I was sitting alone in the living room, the faint hum of the ceiling fan the only sound accompanying me. My phone buzzed on the table, the sharp vibration cutting through the quiet. I glanced at it, expecting nothing more than a late-night notification, but what I saw made my stomach drop. The message, from an unknown number, simply said, "Look outside." A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the screen. My heart began to thud painfully in my chest. Who could it be? What did they want? My fingers felt heavy as I placed the phone back down, but curiosity, or maybe fear, compelled me to get up. The room seemed to stretch endlessly as I made my way to the window, each step weighed down by hesitation. The curtains moved slightly, caught by the faint breeze from the fan, and for a moment, it felt like they were alive, teasing me. I pulled the fabric aside and peered into the night. The street was empty, illuminated only by the cold, flickering glow of a street lamp. Shadows stretched and twisted across the pavement, but no one was there. Still, the unease wouldn't leave me. My hands shook as I double-checked the locks on the front door before stepping away. Then, another buzz. My phone's sudden vibration made me flinch, my body betraying the fear that was now coursing through me. I picked it up, my breath caught in my throat as I read the new message. "Did you see me?" The words hit me like a cold gust of wind. My fingers trembled as I typed back a single question: "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately, as if they had been waiting for me to ask. "I'm watching you." A suffocating dread crept over me. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, someone with a sick sense of humor trying to scare me. Maybe it was a neighbor, or a friend trying to be funny. But deep down, I knew. This was different. I typed back, "Leave me alone." My message felt futile, weak. Minutes passed like hours, and no reply came. The tension hung in the air, thick and heavy. Desperate for a distraction, I turned on the television, hoping to drown out the quiet. The screen flickered to life, the news anchor's somber voice filling the room. They spoke of rising crime in the area, burglaries, and home invasions. I turned the volume down, regretting my decision. The silence returned, amplifying every creak of the house, every faint rustle of the wind outside. Then, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message, it was a picture. My hands were clammy as I opened it, my heart sinking as the image loaded. It was a photo of my front porch, taken from just outside my door. I froze, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. The picture wasn't from earlier. It was now. Whoever had sent it was outside, only a few feet away. Panic surged through me. I dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. The operator's calm reassurances felt distant, almost unreal. They promised to send someone, urging me to stay inside and remain calm. Minutes dragged by, each second stretching into eternity. Then, a loud knock echoed through the house. It wasn't the polite knock of someone delivering a package or a neighbor dropping by, it was deliberate, forceful, almost taunting. I approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. My breath caught in my throat. No one was there. My phone buzzed again. Another message, you should open the door. A cold wave of fear crashed over me. I grabbed a kitchen knife, feeling foolish but desperate. My hands were slick with sweat, my grip on the knife unsteady. I stood in the middle of the living room, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Then, the sound of shattering glass. It came from the back of the house. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, and I ran to the kitchen, my pulse racing. The back door's window had been smashed, and the door hung slightly ajar, swinging in the wind. I called out, my voice shaky but defiant, "Who's there?" The only response was silence. I dialed 911 again, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. The operator urged me to find a safe place and lock myself in. The bathroom felt like the only option. I locked the door behind me and crouched in the corner, gripping the knife tightly. The minutes stretched on, each second punctuated by the faint sounds of movement outside the bathroom door. Then, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. The doorknob rattled, and I held my breath, praying they wouldn't come inside. Finally, the footsteps retreated, and I heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance. Relief flooded through me as the operator confirmed that officers were outside. A firm knock at the front door, followed by a voice identifying themselves as police, finally broke the spell of fear. I unlocked the bathroom door and crept into the living room, still clutching the knife. The officers entered, guns drawn, and began searching the house. They found nothing inside. But outside, near the bushes by the front porch, they discovered two things, a phone and a mask. The mask was blank and featureless, its emptiness somehow more terrifying than if it had been grotesque. The phone had been smashed, its screen shattered. The police stayed for a while, ensuring the house was secure. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but their words felt hollow. I thanked them, though my nerves were still raw. For days, I lived in a heightened state of awareness. I installed new locks, cameras, and motion detectors. I told friends and family about what had happened, making sure someone always knew where I was. Weeks passed, and life began to feel normal again. But one night, as I sat scrolling through my phone, a notification appeared. The message was from an unknown number. It read, "You got lucky last time." My heart stopped. For a moment, fear threatened to consume me. But as I stared at the words, something shifted. I was no longer the same person I had been that night. I stood up, looking around at my now secure home. Determination surged through me. I refused to let fear control me any longer. Whatever, or whoever, they were, I wouldn't let them win. Story 9. The hallway had always been quiet. Too quiet. It was one of those unremarkable spaces, a narrow stretch of floor lined with identical doors, each leading to a different room. It was the kind of place you walked through without a second thought, a mundane part of the house that held no significance. Or so I thought. That night, something shifted. The light above me flickered once, then twice, throwing restless shadows that swayed on the walls like silent phantoms. I paused mid-step, my heart skipping a beat as the bulb flickered a third time, then plunged the hallway into darkness. For a moment, I stood motionless, swallowed by the pitch-black silence. My breathing was shallow as I strained my eyes to adjust. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but in those seconds, I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near the staircase, stood a figure. It didn't move. It didn't waver. It simply stood there, a silhouette barely visible against the faint sliver of moonlight filtering through the distant window. It looked human, almost, but there was something profoundly wrong about it. Something unnatural. A chill crept up my spine as I froze in place, unable to move, my thoughts spiraling into chaos. Was it real? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? The air grew heavier, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were inching closer. My palms were damp with sweat, my legs refusing to obey the primal urge to flee. I took a hesitant step forward. The floor beneath me creaked softly, the sound swallowed by the suffocating quiet. The shadow at the end of the hallway remained perfectly still. It didn't shift, didn't flinch. It simply loomed there, watching. I could feel it. Its gaze, if you could call it that, boring into me, dissecting me, as though it were more than just a shadow. My chest tightened, every breath an effort, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I was dreaming. The kind of dream where you're trapped in the familiar, yet something is grotesquely, undeniably wrong. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the light flickered back on. The shadow was gone. I blinked, my vision adjusting to the now brightly lit hallway. It was empty, just as it always had been. Just as it should have been. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, perhaps. Or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew better. I retreated to my room, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I replayed the scene over and over in my mind. The figure. The stillness. The weight of its presence. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the image of that shadow clung to me like a second skin. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind sent my nerves on edge. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something had been there. Watching. Waiting. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, banishing the unease, if only for a moment. I checked the hallway, desperate to reassure myself it had been a dream. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone, or anything. Not even a scuff on the floor where the shadow had stood. Days passed. I tried to move on, to convince myself that it was all in my head. But every time I stepped into that hallway, I couldn't ignore the sense of wrongness. The lights didn't flicker again, and the shadow didn't return. Not at first. Then, one evening, as I sat on the couch with the TV casting its pale glow across the room, I heard it, a sound. Soft at first, like the shuffle of feet on hardwood. My body went rigid as I muted the television, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. My pulse quickened, the hair on my arms standing on end. I stood slowly, my eyes darting toward the hallway. It was empty, just as it had been every night since. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, clearer, a deliberate, rhythmic movement. Someone, or something, was there. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I stepped toward the hallway. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my stomach twisting in knots. A voice in the back of my mind screamed at me to stop, to turn back. But I couldn't. The hallway was colder than it should have been, the air biting against my skin as I opened the door and stepped out. At first, I saw nothing. Just the empty stretch of floor. But then, as I reached the end of the hallway, my heart sank. There, on the wall where the shadow had stood, was a mark. A dark smear, almost imperceptible, as though someone, or something, had pressed against the wall with force. I moved closer, my breath hitching as I realized what it was. A handprint. Large. Smudged. Inhuman. I stumbled backward, my mind racing as a wave of nausea washed over me. I barely made it back to my room, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, dialing 911. "I think there's someone in my house," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Stay calm," the operator replied. "Help is on the way." I waited, every second feeling like an eternity, my eyes fixed on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. When the police arrived, they searched every inch of the house. They found nothing. The handprint? Gone. Vanished, as though it had never been there. The officers were polite but skeptical. They suggested it was a trick of the light, maybe my imagination. But I knew what I had seen. What I had felt. Now, every time I pass that hallway, I can't help but glance over my shoulder. The shadow hasn't returned, or at least, I haven't seen it. But some nights, when the house is quiet and the world feels still, I hear it. The soft shuffle of feet. The whisper of something just out of sight. And I wonder. Is it waiting for me? Story 10. It was an ordinary evening. I was curled up on the couch, idly scrolling through my phone, the soft glow of the screen casting shadows across the room. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards, a familiar sound I had grown used to. But then, amidst the stillness, I heard it. My name. It was clear, deliberate, and calm, floating down from somewhere upstairs. It wasn't a desperate shout or a cry for help, it was soft, almost beckoning, as if whoever, or whatever, was calling wanted my attention. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, ears straining against the silence. Did I really hear that? My eyes darted around the room, searching for an explanation. The front door was locked, the windows shut tight, and there was no sign that anyone else was here. Yet the sound of my name echoed in my mind like a whispered secret. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I stood, legs trembling beneath me. I moved cautiously toward the staircase, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was just tired. But the silence was heavy now, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, looking up into the darkened hallway above. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to grab my phone and call someone, anyone. But curiosity, or perhaps something else entirely, pushed me forward. With each step, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if the house didn't want me to reach the top. By the time I stood at the landing, my pulse was a frantic drumbeat in my ears. I glanced down the hallway, where the bedroom doors stood closed and unmoving. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I forced myself to walk down the hall, each step sounding deafening in the oppressive quiet. The first door creaked as I pushed it open. The room was just as I had left it, undisturbed, ordinary. But the air felt wrong, colder somehow, as if the warmth of the house had been sucked out. I scanned every corner, my eyes flicking from shadow to shadow, expecting, dreading, that something would move. But there was nothing. I stepped back into the hallway, my unease growing with each passing second. I moved to the next door and then the next, each room a mirror of the last, untouched, empty, but steeped in an inexplicable dread. And then, I reached the last door. The air here was different, heavier, colder, and charged with something I couldn't name. My instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn back. But my hand was already reaching for the doorknob, my curiosity stronger than my fear. The moment my fingers brushed the handle, I heard it again, a voice, faint but insistent, calling my name. This time, it came from inside the room. My breath hitched as I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Just like the others, nothing was out of place. No sign of intrusion, no indication that anyone had been here. But the feeling of wrongness was suffocating now. It pressed against my chest, cold and unrelenting. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath me, and froze. The voice came again, soft, almost a whisper, yet unmistakable. It called my name. I spun around, my eyes darting to every corner, expecting to see someone, or something. But there was no one. The room was empty, yet the sensation of being watched was unbearable. A shiver crawled up my spine, and every hair on my body stood on end. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. And then, I felt it. A presence behind me, so close I could almost feel breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I bolted, my body finally obeying the primal urge to flee. I stumbled down the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet as I reached the stairs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I raced down the steps, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. The only thought in my mind was escape. I reached the front door, my hands fumbling with the handle, but before I could open it, I heard it again. The voice. It was behind me now, closer, more insistent. My name. I turned, chest heaving, but the hallway was empty. The house was still, silent, but colder than ever. My stomach churned as I realized I wasn't alone, even if I couldn't see who, or what, was there. I didn't wait to find out. I yanked the door open and ran into the night, my bare feet slapping against the pavement as I sprinted down the driveway. I didn't stop until I was at the end of the street, my lungs burning and my legs trembling beneath me. Only then did I turn to look back. The house loomed in the darkness, its windows black and lifeless. It seemed quiet, peaceful, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Something had been in there with me. Something that wanted me to stay. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back. Even now, as I sit here trying to make sense of it all, I can still hear that voice, faint and distant, calling my name. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's still waiting for me to answer.